My new Nevermore Notes book club, which you can join through the Fable app linked down below, is just finishing up reading Turn of the Screw by Henry James. It's a short novella published in 1898, and it is a pretty straightforward ghost story told by a nameless governess. And I think it's earned its status as a classic because even though the actual point-by-point events of what happened feel very clear, whether or not the ghosts are real, what those ghosts wanted, also ends up feeling very ambiguous at the same time. Which is an odd feeling for me to be so confused by something that's really very straightforward in its presentation. Part of me can't help but wonder how it was received when it was first published and if some of my struggles have to do with my own inability to interpret stuff that was culturally or socially normal at the time, which made me really interested to find some kind of modernization of this story so I could see how other people were interpreting or presenting it. Brings me to an adaptation in 2020 called The Turning. At an hour and a half long, it's a little bit longer, I think, than the length of the novella has earned, but it says to me that there's definitely potential for all elements of this novella to be included in that runtime. There is some troubled production and development behind The Turning. It originally started its development in March of 2016 with Steven Spielberg. It changed directors over, going from The Haunting into its current title, The Turning, Floria Sigmani. And in the few interviews I could find, she stated her goal for this movie was to do a feminist take on Turn of the Screw or do a Me Too-ified version of this story. Which, given that Turn of the Screw is told from a governess's perspective that's not super far off of the story's original intent, that said, I don't see anything that relates to Me Too in this movie, and I'm not going to be touching that with a 10-foot pole in this evaluation. The title, The Turning, is a play on Henry James' title, The Turn of the Screw. And I know turn of the screw is not really a very common idiom today, but it basically means to put pressure on an already bad situation. And within the context of the novel's prologue, we have a bunch of characters getting together for Christmas Eve. They have some kind of haunted experience that wakes the child of the house up. They feel that having the single child come down and sort of be privy to this supernatural stuff is a turn of the screw on the supernatural situation they were involved in. Kicks off this one dude asking if one child is one turn of the screw, what is it when there are two children involved in some kind of horrific supernatural story? And that gets everyone interested and gets him to get his papers from this governess's true account that happens to be the narrative we then roll into. So if James's novel Turn of the Screw is about putting pressure on an already bad situation, The Turning should be focusing on the act of pressure. And if that's actually the focal element of The Turning, I think some of the execution here is really brilliantly done. There is a bombardment of constant movement, constant acts and gestures that have double meaning right under the surface that about halfway through my first watch of this, taking notes, I stopped. Because I was just pausing after every scene, recording the entirety of the scene with all these little gestures and nuances and all the different meanings. I was starting to get whiplash from contemplating it and recording it. It was really drawing me out of the experience of the movie. Not to mention, if you make note of every little thing, then none of your notes are important, so I wasn't even really doing good note taking. Because there were all these double meanings, there were all these undercurrents going through everything, I always felt like I had a pretty poor lay of the land in The Turning, and that makes sense for a story that's focused on what that pressure is. Just so you know, before we go any further, there are going to be spoilers for both Turn of the Screw and The Turning. Both the novella and the movie have what I would call a cold open. The novella has that prologue I mentioned before where we actually start outside of the story with a group of characters sitting around a fire enjoying an event and encouraging this dude to get this woman's real life account and tell the story to them. And from there, the story is him reading the governess's first-hand account of what happened to her at Bly Manor. In the movie, the cold opening has us starting with Miss Jessel fleeing Bly Manor in the dead of night with some storming and her obviously in distress. She gets into her car, she gets to the gate won't open, she goes out to open it, and when she does, she gets attacked by Quint and killed. While all of this is happening, Flora is in a window of Bly Manor watching it go down. And in some ways I think it's a nice echo that the book has a prologue and the movie sort of has a prologue. And in theory, it could be nice because the turning is opening with facts. Like, we know there is a Bly Manor, there was a previous governess, and something happened to that governess, and Flora witnessed it. But after completing my watch of the turning, I don't really know what to think of this cold open. Like, I worry that instead of trying to be innovative and experimental like Henry James was in his original narration style of Turn of the Screw, which was very unique for its time, this cold open exists to like reinforce traditional horror narratives where you get that like intro first minute kill, even though the camera set us up as if we were observing actual true events, that we were in like an omniscient third person lens. This is not the case, and if that's what's going on, then I wonder a little bit about the narrative storytelling of the story overall. And there are several contradictions in the Turning's narration that make you question what you're seeing or not seeing, which could be intentional on the filmmaker's part and sort of creating the same ambiguity about the governess's story we get in the original Turn of the Screw, or it could be poor filmmaking. We'll have to see what your take is on it when we're done talking about it. And that rolls me into modernizing the story as a whole. The Turning is set in 1994 in the USA, where Turn of the Screw is in 1898 in England. Sigmani stated that she wanted the story to be modernized, but she didn't want technology interfering with things, and that's why it's in 1990. I do like that. It gets to be very hard when everyone is so connected to create a accurate, isolated, longing kind of feeling you get in a lot of Gothic work. And like the shorthand that there's no cell service or whatever starts to get tiresome. I do think it was a bit of a missed opportunity that we didn't use a ton of 90s music, because this could have been a really dark Gothic rock ballad and I'd have loved that personally. But overall, I would say the sound design as it is quite good. Specifically, I'm thinking about the stable scene where she first meets Flora. She goes into that stable and it's dead silent. And then Flora runs by and suddenly just like the normal sounds of the stable come back into view, which is like horses clomping and birds and all that other kind of stuff. And going from silence to like the reality of the world is jarring and sort of letting us know that there is something going on here. Also, the outfits that our governess, now named Kate, wears every day in this movie are stunning. I really love the attention to costuming and detail here, and I want every single one of Kate's outfits too. Like, just go ahead and send me the wardrobe. They looked amazing. And because the outfits fit the 90s but also were like super varied, it made it very easy for me to process the change of a day and how much time had elapsed. That slow wear down, that slow loss, and like insomnia, regression, and terrorizing really takes its toll on Kate, and I think the outfits tell part of that story. It is interesting overall to both modernize the story and set it in the USA, because in the original Turn of the Screw, there's like a pretty large classism, classist element to it. The idea of transgressing your place in the class system or overstepping your bounds of authority becomes part of the horror and part of the thing that's like signifying evil, as well as the governess's actual struggle to like take control of the whole home of Bly Manor and be the authority figure for these children as well as the governess. In some ways, the story is kind of implying she was destined to fail from the start because she's just a governess. She's not like a lord of the manor or whatever. So the fact that he like asked her to do this thing she inherently couldn't do set her up for failure. And like all of these elements are working in the original story to build the horror, build the sense of wrongness or whatever, didn't exactly jive with me and my modern take on class and social structure, right? But I also don't quite know how you do the story without them. And the movie does a pretty good job substituting in the British older Mrs. Gross as sort of like a manifestation of that, because she has been with this like rich family since the kid's father was a child, and she says it was like an honor and a privilege to be with the family, and she calls the kids thoroughbreds and like automatically places their status and their class and their character way above her and above Kate the governess. She keeps reinforcing what everyone's roles and boundaries are, where everyone's job is, and like to quote unquote know their place. So I do think that was a great solution to still like instilling those classist elements without like reimagining the class structure or everyone's viewpoint on class in such a way that just wouldn't feel real in a modern era. And I sort of like how using Mrs. Gross in this way externalizes the class struggle and makes it like an an obvious outside antagonizing force. It sort of further illustrates how strict policing of where a person belongs, what they can and can't do, and whether we should or shouldn't care about them at all often leads to tragedy. There's a couple other changes the turning makes that I kind of chalk up to modernizing the story. For example, we give the governess, Kate, both a name and a backstory, which neither are present in the original text. Now she's a teacher who knows what it's like to grow up as an orphan. She feels like this extra commitment to being positive change and sort of like turning her world around specifically. Also, as like a side note, we learn that Kate's mom is in a mental asylum, which to me felt like a slight contradiction of what she said in the front, where she was like, I know what it's like to be an orphan. But I guess we can assume that her mother had a mental breakdown while she was a young child, and that made her without guardian and put her into the foster system even though she wasn't an orphan. I do want to point out though this contradiction because it's one of the many small contradictions we see that later bring us back to questioning whether or not Kate's mom is real at all. Kate never meets the kid's guardian in this story, which like feels like it might not be too big a deal because the uncle is the guardian in the original story and the governess only meets him twice in chapter 1. The governess and Mrs. Gross gossip about him all the time. How good looking he is, what a charmer he is, how kind he is. The governess seems to talk out of both sides of her mouth, like that she would never presume he was interested in her, but at the same time that he saw her as someone special and particularly capable, and perhaps this is a way for her to prove herself and like become his wife or romantically involved in some way. But also she would never do those things. All of it is really weird and off-putting and like as a modern reader made no sense to me. I kind of chalked it up to like men writing women and not really knowing what women talk about, especially like what they may or may not feel towards like a bachelor master of the house who's not even present in the home. I suppose it could be accurate to how women talked at that time, I don't really know, but it felt like an alien scene. So removing his presence at all kind of makes sense in the turning. However, getting rid of the uncle in some ways raises more questions because I started to wonder like who these orphans' guardians are. Someone like had to interview Kate and give her the position, and it's obviously not Mrs. Gross because when Mrs. Gross and Kate first meet, Mrs. Gross seems very underwhelmed and asks questions like, have you ever worked at someone's house before? Which she would know if she'd been the interviewee. But like them being totally alone in this rambling house in 1994 just feels very odd. Like where is the guardian? Who is the person who is the ultimate authority for these children? The setup is less odd in the original novella. It wasn't really that uncommon to like delegate those to the governess and the nanny. Certainly, even in like Jane Eyre, where Mr. Rochester is technically living there while Jane Eyre is the tutor, Jane Eyre has like completely taken over day-to-day tasks, so I have to assume this is like normal in their life. But what's going on here doesn't feel normal in modern times. I really liked the presentation of Flora and Miles. There's a lot of descriptive passages in the original work about the children, how angelic and perfect and beautiful and charming they are. It is so much, so intense, and at the same time so vague. I found it really weird and obsessive and creepy. Again, I wondered a little bit if this is like an issue of men writing women and them thinking like women just fucking love children and are super obsessed with them all the time. And I also wondered if these children were just that amazing and what that meant. But I was especially interested in something like The Turning to see how we translate that to a modern audience. And I found Flora immediately charming and precocious and fun in all the right ways for like a 90s kid and how we expect kids to be, like the right balance of mischievous, adventurous, shy, wanting to appease, also wanting to prank and rebel. And I think the way that both Flora and Miles are set up is such that you can see that they're good kids, they're nice, they have a lot of positive qualities, but they turn on a dime into really like intense and creepy. And it's hard to tell if this is like them feeling entitled because they're like upper crust, upper class, and like Mrs. Gross is reinforcing that and there's no other adults around to do anything else, or if they're acting this way because something supernatural is going on, or maybe there's like a slow possession, or maybe these kids just have a mean streak. Like that ambiguity, the way they turn on a dime time very effective visually and storytelling wise for me. It's not 100% accurate to the original where the kids are not creepy at all pretty much at any time. I liked it better here because it created more atmosphere and it created a stronger sense of uncertainty about what was or wasn't happening narratively in the story. I think they aged Miles up. In the original book, Miles is 9, and the movie never directly states how old this Miles is, but he looks and acts older than 9, which is good because Miles is sort of taking on some of that like sexual threat, sexual energy that we got from like the uncle in the original story. And this makes sense because Quint also had like this sort of sexual magnetism about him, and Miles is supposed to sort of directly correlate to Quint. So sort of like mashing that up and streamlining it makes sense. Also, there is this sense that the governess was originally both afraid for and afraid of Miles in the novel. And that doesn't 100% make sense with a 9-year-old child. But here where we've aged up the child and we've said that he committed a violent crime in his boarding school, we've suddenly made him much more threatening to like this small, petite, younger woman. So let's talk about things the movie does better than novella. The communication of the supernatural. In the original Turn of the Screw, the governess just sees ghosts and like describes them like they're people wandering around. In fact, she doesn't even know that she is seeing ghosts until she talks to Mrs. Gross, and the physical description of the ghost makes Mrs. Gross think of people who are dead. So the presentation, the appearance and disappearance of these people, it's a little bit strange, but all of it feels like within the realm of like a person could be doing it. And that takes away some of the tension for me because it's not like obviously supernatural, it's not creepy, it's very humanoid. And it also makes me feel like maybe these ghosts don't want to hurt anyone. How do we know what the ghosts want? Like all these other kinds of things, because the governess makes a lot of conjecture and claim, but we never really see anything to back it up. The ghosts never really do anything that creepy, at least in my estimation. Like they're just there sometimes and gone other times. The governess is the only one who ever experiences these ghosts. She claims the children know about the ghosts and have seen them, but when confronted, the children deny it. You never see the children looking directly in the same direction as the ghosts or giving any other hint that they know. The governess says they do, and she gives like word soup as to why, but it is hard to imagine that's the case. And there's even one instance where the ghost is there, and so is the governess, Flora, and Mrs. Gross, and they all look in that direction, and the only person who can see the ghost is the governess. And for some reason, Mrs. Gross still believes her about the ghosts even after that and is still like very afraid of them. If I were Mrs. Gross, this is where I'd start to be afraid of the governess, even if I had believed her until this point. Again, I don't know if this is a commentary on class and how Mrs. Gross feels she's lower than the governess, so she has to believe the governess, or if Mrs. Gross is pretending, or what's going on in that scene exactly. It feels like there are a couple of things that could be happening in that moment. None of them relate to there being supernatural or a good portrayal of supernatural though. The movie, in contrast, like has the advantage of being a visual medium, so we can visually see the ghosts and see that they're different than human people. But there are also moments in the movie where things move on their own, where Flora actually draws the ghost like watching over her, where we can see the ghost in the mirror, where Miles talks to a ghost, and at first we think it's an imaginary whatever, but actually then he says something that's sort of creepy and indicates maybe it's a ghost. Like all these depictions create more uncertainty, are significantly more interesting, like the bumps and thuds we hear coming from the one room, even like when the governess gets locked down in the basement and is kind of getting pushed around and like hearing and seeing different things. It just felt so much more engaging than the original context of these ghosts and felt like more of a possibility of supernatural than anything we read on page. And I think big props to the director here because she does talk about how she wanted it to feel decayed and how like the bedspread and the wallpaper is very lush at first glance, and then as you get closer you see that the paper is peeling and everything is kind of tattered. That came across and was very interesting to see all these really fine, beautiful things, and then the closer you got to them, the more you see they were like worn down and uncared for and just slowly decaying. It created like a creepy environment. It created a ginormous manor that would be very easy to get lost in, and a lot of pockets and places for creepy things to happen, or for people to be hiding, or maybe for there to be secret passages, or who knows what, right? Where in the book, I kind of pictured Bly Manor just being like a clean, random manor out in the country. I didn't really feel like it was dilapidated or worn down. I didn't feel any kind of way about it being like spooky or haunted. I figured it was drafty because it's an old manor home, but like drafty is not spooky necessarily. So there's just like a lot more of a vibe and ambiance that you expect with like a gothic horror in the visual here than we were getting descriptively or narratively in Bly Manor in the story. Also, I feel like the performances here really bring things to life. I already talked about how great Flora and Miles were, and I think they got great performances out of both of them, but the governess, Kate, also does an amazing job, and arguably Mrs. Gross does well too. I'm just conflicted about her character, period. But she does a good job with what she was asked to do. And the governess does an amazing job, starting with like that friendly, cheerful, happy to be here, really wanting to help, and like slowly devolving and losing her sense on reality, losing her sense of the plot. Visually that was brought across, but also like her facial expressions, little like quirks and moves, close-ups on her face, all of them were working pretty well for me, which rolls me into stuff that's about the same across both of them. Addressing the unreliability of the narrator. So in Turn of the Screw, there's a lot that doesn't make sense. But obviously the most concerning element of the whole story is that the governess is the only one who sees these ghosts. She says the children have seen the ghosts and are intentionally not looking at them to not alert other people. She says the ghosts are trying to lure the children away. Away to where? Away for what? We never really talk about, but it's a thing to be concerned about. She says that her witnessing the ghosts is a way for her to protect the children, which again is never analyzed. She says that removing Flora from the house will free Flora from the hold of these ghosts. Again, nothing to support this. Mrs. Gross is super happy to see the governess, and it's speculated as to why, but never outright said, and Mrs. Gross continually supports, believes, and agrees with the governess, even when it should be apparent that there's something else going on. And because of all of these like inconsistencies and who's experiencing what and when, we do have to question whether or not the governess is a reliable narrator. And while we know, spoilers, that Miles dies at the end of this story, we don't really know how or why. Even if we believe that the ghosts are real, how does that kill Miles? Why does it kill Miles? And if we don't believe the ghosts are real and we think something else is going on, did the governess kill Miles? Did she like accidentally smother him? Did she do it on purpose? And this is like, I don't know, some kind of break from reality so that she can accept what she did? It just leaves you feeling very flat at the end and unsure about what you just read. The turning starts off with like a much stronger sense of this mental instability when we meet Kate's mom and see that she's in a mental home. Do you think possibly we're going to tackle whether or not mental illness is hereditary, or we're setting Kate up to be like that mentally fragile woman who could be having some kind of breakdown? And in some ways that's nice because the gothic female lead is usually mentally fragile or more sensitive in some way, shape, or form, so like this is a decent way to modernize that take. And I do think the movie does a decent job playing up some of Kate's mental fragility, especially with her interactions with Miles. And there's like a good balance of questioning throughout the movie about whether or not it's all in her head, or it's ghosts, or it's some in between. Because when she plays flashlight tag with the kids and gets stuck in the basement, she assumes that it's Miles who's tormenting her. And when she gets up the top of the stairs and confronts Miles, Miss Gross says that Miles has been with her for the last 15 minutes, so whatever happened is not on him. Or like Miles has that scene with the imaginary friend where he tells her the tattoo is sexy, and she's super freaked out by it and thinks it's like a stalker ghost or whatever, but the tattoo is literally on the back of her neck and she has short hair, so the kids could easily have seen the tail end of it and Miles could just be messing with her without ever actually seeing the whole of the tattoo. Or, you know, we've seen that both of the children sneak into her room at various times, so maybe they snuck in and saw the whole thing while she was sleeping. I don't know, but either way, I don't think knowing about a tattoo on the back of your neck is proof of ghosts. And even like how Kate responds to a prank the children pull where they put this doll in the water and pretend it's Flora drowning, and she dives in to get it, finds out it's a doll, and comes out and yell at them. Like, it's very clear that being in the water like that and seeing someone drown is some kind of mental break for her that sort of like turns turns a switch and like freaks her out, which that combined with the fact that we saw her mom doing art in an empty drained pool indicates some kind of something with Kate and water that could be potentially interesting to explore further. There's even some interesting play about how mental illness and mental instability comes with like a sensitivity that could also be like psychic medium. Kate's mom sends her a bunch of pictures, and it seems like those pictures might be drawing of a potential future where she successfully escapes Bly Manor, or it could be her looking at these black charcoal drawings and having some kind of delusion, fantasy, mental break. Unfortunately, the ambiguity here and like the sense of the movie trying to say something, anything about ghosts or mental illness or mental sensitivity or social fragility sort of gets ruined by the theatrical ending where Kate like wakes up in bed, she's in the drained pool and there's her mother like drawing, and then she goes to face her mother and what she sees on her mother's face horrifies her, sort of implying that she sees that this mentally unwell person isn't her mother, it's actually been her the whole time, and the whole thing has sort of been imagined until that point, which like leaves us a lot more questions than answers. Like, why is she imagining this? Did she have a break while at Bly Manor? Is the whole thing made up? There's a lot of things you could speculate from here, none of which feel like super satisfying or seem to really fully carry over that mental ambiguity into a way that like had more weight or meaning, which rolls me into the constant bombardment of stuff. I talked a little bit about it at the top of this review, but I was taking notes in both the book and the movie and eventually stopped in both cases because I was just giving a play-by-play of the exact scenes that were happening and then talking about all the different undercurrents and double meanings and potential implications of it. And it wasn't good summarizing because I was writing every single thing down and then laying out all the possibilities from there. So I stopped taking those notes, but it did give me this sense of mental fatigue and overwhelm that I have to assume the governess in both Turn of the Screw and Kate as the governess in The Turning must have felt, that was like wearing her down and like fraying her at the edges, making her either more susceptible to the supernatural or more susceptible to a mental breakdown, just depending on what you think happened there. The kids' trauma. At first I thought we were going to get a better look at this. In Turn of the Screw we find out the uncle came into possession of his brother's children when he and the wife died in India, and you think like, wow, these kids just lost their mom and dad and then immediately lost their next set of caretakers like right behind them. They must be like mentally messed up. Obviously, we don't talk about trauma and children and trauma in this time period, so that's never addressed or even like played with at all. And you would expect a modernization to do that, which they go an extra step and say the parents actually died while leaving Bly Manor and that Flora witnessed their car accident and death. And you think, oh, okay, we are really and truly going there. And then no evidence really of trauma. Flora says something about how she was sad that Jessa left without saying goodbye to her, and that's as close as we come to it. Oh, also, Flora is afraid to leave the manor because she thinks she'll die if she leaves it. But since we're playing with that in a way where it's like maybe she's a ghost or maybe this is her trauma, it doesn't really come off super well. Rolling us into where the adaptation falls short. I think including Kate having a roommate and her continuing to touch base with that roommate was sort of like a missed opportunity. The absolute and total isolation at Bly Manor and the way the governess has to make decisions without reaching out to anyone for help, and in fact, when things get bad enough and she decides to reach out to the uncle and just pay the price for bothering him, her letter gets stolen and taken from her. All of this is part of the horror, part of the pressure and the turn of the screw, as it were. And I think having the roommate here like relieves some of the pressure because first the roommate is like super supportive and friendly. She calls her while she's at Bly Manor and they get to have a little chit chat. And again, when the governess is at her breaking point and she goes into town, she calls her from a payphone in a scene that's very visually confusing because there's a ton of swans and I couldn't for the life of me figure out what the swans were doing there or why they were part of the shot. But besides that, the governess and her roommate talk, and the governess talks herself into going back to Bly Manor, which is technically book accurate because there's a moment where she's considering leaving Bly Manor and that this is too much for her, and then she decides she must stay for the sake of the children. But I feel like we could have had that scene without having the roommate. Like, she could have started packing her things, Flora could have called from her, like asking for help for something, or could have run in, like given her a hug, and then she could have had a moment, looked at the suitcase and unpacked it. and we could have realized like what was going on visually without a conversation between her and her roommate. It connected her to the world in a way that I don't think helps with the overall story, and it also made it feel like there was someone she could reach out to for help, so she was less alone and isolated than I think ideally you'd want. All of the weird spider stuff with Miles. So in the Turning, Bly Manor is apparently filled to the brim with spiders because Miles finds them all the time, feeds them to his pet trapdoor spider, finds them on Kate and like crushes them to death for her to protect her or whatever. It was weird. I couldn't figure out what they were trying to say with the spiders. Like, was it just a generic spiders are bad and creepy and evil, so here are some of them? Was the fact that Miles owned a trapdoor spider and was crushing other spiders like an indication that he was like very dangerous? Like, I don't know. I know there's an alternate ending where like a spider comes out of Miles' mouth and is supposed to like indicate the haunting or whatever, but I don't understand why this was included. It felt very fillery and weird. Also, the combo imaginary friend and the fact that Flora can't leave the property or she'll die. I touched on both of these briefly already, but Flora is afraid to leave the property, and whether that's because she saw both her parents die when they left the property as well as Miss Jessel, or if that's because she's supposed to be like a ghost of some kind and incapable of leaving is sort of like up in the air, especially because we never see her leave. It's a weird reverse echo of what happens in the book Turn of the Screw, because in that story, Miss Gross takes Flora off the property and that saves her life and depossesses her from the ghost or whatever. And here, taking her off the property would kill her? Question mark? Or maybe not taking her off the property, like she keeps requesting not to be taken off the property, confirms her possession and further locks her in. I don't know, because that part of the story is sacrificed in favor of making it very clear that the governess is insane. A lot of the story and other conventions they're using suffer because they make it too obvious the governess is insane. But in particular, this is mentioned so rarely and has such little impact. I guess they wanted to use it as an excuse to why Flora couldn't leave and make it feel like they were even more trapped on property, but they could just not have ever had reason to leave and been isolated on property without ever bringing up, I don't know, going into town or whatever. And then the imaginary friend thing I think is supposed to further connect Miles to Quinn because he's actually talking to Quinn's ghost and that's what's going on. But it doesn't read super well. It only gets done overtly once. And I think if they wanted to incorporate this element, we would have needed Miles talking to the ghost a little bit more, showing up and being creepy a little bit more often. I prefer some of the more subtle elements of Miles being Quinn, like when Miles is teaching Kate how to ride a horse and he's whipping the crap out of the horse and she's like struggling to stay on her seat and she's like, you don't have to whip the horse that hard, and he's like, yes I do because Quinn said this, and then he says something like super menacing and terrible. For me, that kind of creepiness where it was like, is he talking about a memory of Quinn or is he like directly channeling Quinn and how Quinn feels about horses right now, a lot more ominous and terrifying, because whether or not there's a ghost and whether or not that ghost is possessing Miles takes a back seat to the fact that Miles, either way, if he's just like a damaged child or if he's actually under possession, is potentially a highly dangerous child, both to Flora and to Kate. And lastly, I hated that Kate has this ugly Ouroboros snake tattoo on the back of her neck. Based off of everything we know about Kate, it doesn't make any sense for her to have the tattoo specifically in Ouroboros, and especially on the back of her neck. She's like a young elementary school teacher. Why would she have this ginormous kind of ugly tattoo? That makes no sense for her career goals. They didn't connect her and the Ouroboros to anything. I really think the only reason the tattoo was there so we could have the creepy line about Miles knowing about the tattoo. But again, since I want us to get rid of the imaginary friend bullshit, we can just get rid of this tattoo that feels out of character and out of place in the story as well. Overall, I would say as an adaptation, The Turning captures the mood of the original Turn of the Screw. The drama, the constant bombardment of too much things with too many double meanings you could read different ways, all align well with what the original work seemed to be doing. I think the choice to heavily lean into the mental illness is part of where this particular adaptation falls short. Obviously, the original ending leaves with the governess alive and moving on to her next job and Miles dead. Like, there's a horror to a child dying that I just don't think compares, even when you realize your whole life is a lie and you've been in an asylum the whole time. Especially because we don't know if Miles died from some kind of supernatural thing that no one could have stopped, or if Miles was killed by the governess at the end, and we know she goes on to teach other students in other houses. Just like Henry James incorporated a lot of narrative elements that were experimental at the time, I do think we get a lot of visually striking shots and a lot of like set design and costume design elements that feel like artistic and going the extra mile within the turning itself. Unfortunately for the turning, I don't think it takes those experimental elements, those extra layers of visual, and really pulls the whole thing together. Additionally, I think both Turn of the Screw and as a result the turning are kind of only mid-level stories, so there was like a limited level of heights a faithful adaptation could ever reach. As far as like spooky haunted house vibes go, or like ghostly entities go, or even like visual entertainment, I think the turning does really well. If you're looking for a full cohesive story that you're going to be 100% satisfied with after the fact, I don't think either the original novella or this adaptation are going to be for you. But talk to me in those comments down below. Have you seen the turning before? And if so, what did you think? The secret emoji today is going to be a haunted house. And as always, keep reading.